don't get all of our emotional and physical needs met for various reasons. Maybe our parents worked a lot, or one was sick, or we only had one parent, or they had a lot of other kids. Different things can cause this. We can develop these trauma based attachment styles that were created because of our lack of consistent connection. Now, what can happen is if we don't get consistent connection, out of the anxiety that comes up, our psychology creates kind of a structure of response. So, for some people, when their needs weren't met, they became very anxious. So, when their caregiver showed up, because it was kind of inconsistent, they wanted to almost devour the caregiver. They wanted them. They wanted to be with them. They were, sobbing if the parent wasn't available. And there's a lot of feeling of you're going to leave me. So there's a lot of checking on that person. Are you okay? Are we okay? But consistently. So of course that happens where you check in with someone. Hey, I'm feeling, some emotional shift, some energetic shift. Are we doing okay? But this is a lot, and it starts to actually dismantle the relationship. Another way that someone that's more anxious can impact the relationship is they will often kind of overwhelm the person. So anxious people tend to gravitate towards avoidant people because there's an initial spark, love bombing connection, and there's genuine care. So there is a connection that's happening. But once people hit their intimacy kind of capacity, that's when their attachment style starts to come up. So you'll see this where someone meets someone, it's so perfect, and then a week later they're like, I don't know what happened. Like, they just never called me again. They ghosted me. Or I feel a huge shift and I don't know what happened. Like, we didn't have an argument. We aren't fighting about anything. They're not available, And of course, people who aren't available always have reasons. And they're valid. But the real thing is they're not available because they were available a week prior and now you can barely reach them. Or they have all these limits of how they can connect with you. That would be someone that's more avoidantly attached. So they do care about you, but your closeness makes them start to shut down. Sometimes they get kind of grossed out by people. So sometimes when I work with someone that's avoidantly attached, one day they're in love, the next week they don't want the person. And that's because they turn off. And often avoidantly attached individuals create more and more barriers with the anxiously attached, but they're kind of excessive. Like, they don't want to talk about anything and they just want to be fine and they're not very available. And this again activates the anxious person, which makes them push harder, which makes the avoidant pull back. And we start this cycle, this carousel, this pattern of connection intensity, disconnection, anxiety, avoidance. This plays out until usually what happens is the anxious person keeps going at the person until they finally give up because they've tried. They're like, I'm trying to connect with you. You won't connect with me. And then they finally back off. And once they back off for a certain level of time, the avoidant person starts to feel safe. And so they show back up. Hey. And then the anxious person is like, oh my gosh, connection, connection. And then the avoidant person pulls back again. And we start this cycle. And I've seen it over and over where they're stuck in a cycle and neither person is willing to do something different. I would say if you struggle with a partner or a friend or someone who does have an attachment wound, both people have to be willing to do something. I often will see it where there's this imbalance where usually it's the avoidant person. It's usually not the anxious person. They're like, they just need to figure it out because again, that's their avoidance. They're not about union and connecting and how do I compromise? How do I connect with you? They're like, this is what I can offer. Take it or leave it. I would say that's usually an avoidant because they're not understanding that human connection requires compromise. It requires seeing the other person. It's not about this rigid, this is who I am, this is what I can offer. So if you're trying to heal with someone, make sure that they're willing to do some kind of work. Because what I often see when the anxious is trying to heal is they're adjusting to this avoidant person. And it works kind of, but they're full of resentment because it's all on the other person's terms. There's no like flexibility. you know? And there's often a tendency, so avoidant people and anxious people are actually both avoidant of intimacy. So oftentimes someone who is anxious picks someone avoidant because then they can focus all their energy how this person is not available, but in reality they're not available. They can't be honest and vulnerable with this person. They can argue, they can call the other person out, but they can't actually be vulnerable and honest. So I really invite you to notice that cycle. And if it's becoming an issue, get some help. Stop going to this person who is overly available or unavailable and trying to get them to meet all of your emotional needs. If you want to stay with them, which is totally fine, you're going to need a variety of social supports for when that avoidant person is not available, because they're not going to be available. It's not that you're not lovable, it's that they have limitations and they also don't deal with things. So they just turn off. So they're just going to turn off. So, how do I have friendships? How do I have interests? How do I develop a support system? Because there are people who are very interested in how you feel and they're very interested in making connections work. And again, you don't have to leave that person, but stop hoping and pushing them to become that. The same for someone who's avoidant and they're with someone anxious. Part of how you work on it is by communicating more, opening up more, expressing your needs more. You have needs, you're not needless. Acknowledging the other person's experience, whether you agree with it or not. Acknowledging your own limitations. But again, you have to be able to have someone who's willing to work with you. If the anxious person just can't stop bothering you and you need some space and they can't accept that, I don't know if that's going to work. It takes two people, it takes two to tango, and it takes two to make a relationship work. And it's really important to consider that because I know in my own life and watching other people, sometimes people bark up the wrong tree for a long time. And it's really hard because you see a lot of potential, but potential is not enough. It also takes someone that's dedicated. It also takes someone that will make you a priority. If they're not going to make you a priority, that's okay. If they have a ton of other priorities and those are the most important and you're second, you got to look at, do I want that? You know? Because it's not going to change. That's the thing is I see people who have been together for decades and they're in the same problems. Relationships take a lot of work and it takes two people interested and willing. And so notice that for yourself and notice that cycle and get help, get support. Find hobbies, find things that soothe you. Thanks.